My work is focusing on creating belonging and enacting citizenship with young people through creative and digital methods, and it was based in Mytilene in Lesvos. What I will be looking at today with you is how research can become an emerging activity. Mytilene and Lesvos is a particularly of a research context. It's on the border between Greece and Turkey, and millions of refugees, asylum seekers have crossed in order to reach Europe since 2015. Here I will just share some images of the recent years in Mytilene and the different restrictions and violations that happened, especially since the government of New Democracy came into power since 2019. So the nationalistic extremist movements as the attacks of riot police, the militarization of the camp, Moria camp, when COVID took place, see a picture of a shipwreck in 2022, and at the same time, the initiatives of the young people that grew in response. I will be focusing in particular on that. Some of the grassroots initiatives like the Boat Theatre, which was founded in 2019 by young people in Moria camp, and the Rad Music International. As some of you might know, only yesterday there was a shipwreck close to Pylos in Greece. It's supposed to be one of the biggest in history, and according to European rescue support charities, there were almost 750 people on board. This is still contested about how exactly how many they were. The Greek Coastal Guard reported that they went there to help, but the people on board refused assistance and stated their desire to continue their journey. And it was yesterday that the shipwreck happened. There are already around 100 people that are collected and more than 500 that are missing. What I want to focus on that is the position of the Greek Coastal Guard, and what came through many of my interviews, as I will share later on, was the negation of the lived experiences of the people, both by the government, state actors, the Coastal Guard, and the police. My research. I did 27 initial interviews and 8 evaluation interviews, participatory observation for 10 months, a creative group with 8 people, and different community events that emerged from this group. My interlocutors were of the ages between 18 and 32, men and women from different countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Congo, Iraq, Iran, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Greece, and with different legal status, refugees, asylum seekers, and Greek citizens, locals, and internal migrants. And my methods were action participatory research, creative methods, especially dramatherapy and performance activism. For the analysis, I use ethnography and grounded theory. And some of the key theoretical concepts that I will engage in my presentation is first about creating belonging and bordering. Yuval Davis theorizing about how the border becomes a firewall, and those that do not belong can become completely invisible. It is a firewall that allows some people to pass through, and some others are blocked. Citizenship acts. According to Eysen, the acts that transform forms, modes of being political, and they bring into being new actors, new sides, and scales of struggle. What I'm going to look at is how young people engaged in citizenship acts in response to right violations, and they try to claim new rights. And ethics of care, a species of activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world. What I'm going to look at in this presentation is how participatory research can emerge as an act engaging in visibility, and how participatory research can emerge in response to the context, creating environments of care. I will do that by sharing with you the gap and the stretch between my research plan and the activity of my research. So my research plan was to do field work of 6 months in Mytilene and in London, to do collaborations with grassroots organizations, to engage refugee and local people, interviews, creative group. And this plan was built on previous experiences that I had, both in Mytilene and in London. When I went to Mytilene to start my field work, the research plan derailed in many different ways. The first one was if the research can actually happen. It was COVID, there were the lockdowns, and the research could not happen in person. It was really hard to assess participants. My planned collaborations fell through. There was the nationalism and the divisive climate in Mytilene that reached peak levels towards these times. The camp was militarized and not accessible. It was hard to maintain connections with the young people. They were moving and they also did not know when they were going to move, as the legislations were constantly shifting. As I started doing my outreach and speaking to people, I became much more aware of the Eurocentrism in my thinking and the words that I was using, and if they were meaningful or not for my participants, like the word citizenship and who defines it. I saw that many of the people in Mytilene were struggling to meet basic needs, and I started questioning in a different way than when I was writing my plan if people were interested in working creatively and what it would mean for them. I started becoming more aware through testimonies of people about the attacks that they have experienced of the police, and I questioning more safeguarding issues and who is there to protect when the police attacks. And the timeline, actually, I started engaging participants on the 4th month of my designated 6-month stay in Mytilene. In response to this derailing, the activity of my research emerged. My research moved online and I started working with creative and digital methods. The outreach happened through the young people and their communities. As gatekeepers, they introduced me to their own communities, and in the middle of the research, I started collaborating with organizations founded by refugees. And the power dynamics were still present, they were articulated and negotiated among us. As the research moved online, we were able to follow the young people as they were traveling. So the research started with all of us being in Mytilene, and by the end of it, we were in Greece, in UK, in Germany, and in France. And also this movement highlighted different statuses in the group and the power dynamics, who could move and who could not. Engaging also the divisive climate, the research engaged refugees, locals, and focused on their relationships that are usually dismissed by more official integration agendas. My content changed and the design became semi-structured. I started really building on what the young people chose to bring, whether it was sometimes the struggles to find work, how they were coping with the relocation in another country, and that became the start of the sessions, and we used creative methods to explore that. There were also questions if the creative engagement was becoming superficial or not addressing conflict, especially as we were getting to know each other more. And what would happen with people who don't like arts. As the research proceeded, I started engaging the young people also for the research designing, not only the content of it, and engaging critically literature from diverse sources. I chose to focus all my research in Mytilene, and the field work of 2 years, of 6 months became 2 years. I will continue to document this activity of emerging as it was emerging by citizenship acts by the young people as they shared them in the group and in the interviews. So Somaye says about the music concert that she created in response to the rising of Taliban in Afghanistan. It was when Taliban took over Afghanistan. I was really down on that days and I felt really upset about that. I could not focus or work. After listening to many stories, I decided to do something. We made a demonstration, a concert. Many people were participating and all of us were raising our voice that this world should not be silent. Joseph created a grassroots organization in response to the alienation of Moria camp. He wanted to create community through music and dance. He said, I'm in the place of the desert, there is nothing. After they put me, I will die, I said. No one cares. It's really hot and no one cares. We need to approach these people. I go close. Don't worry, this is not easy. It's very hard. But look at these people. They spent years in the prison. They survived. It was the time to bring people together. Since I was playing music, they were dancing. The fights started to decrease. And now we'll move into how the group space became a space for acts to emerge and to nourish acts that were initiated by the young people. This was a collage created by different images the young people uploaded on the chat that we had about what belonging was for them. I will focus in a couple of those images and bring you more the ethnographic context of the young people and what was happening in their lives. One of them was Hassan, who chose to upload this image of food. The time of the group, Hassan had already 3 rejections of asylum. He didn't have a job. He didn't have money for rent or food. He was supported by his flatmate. And just before that happened, he had decided to send all of his savings to take care of his father. Hassan said during the interview, I lost my job and I lost my papers. Myself was lost before 2 months. My father, he died and I'm very sad. But I don't have any document with me. I could not go. Hassan said that his belonging is food sharing, 2 plates of food, to stand back on my feet, to get my papers, to have a big table with food for everyone, to cook for my friends. He participated in all of our meetings from his favorite cafe in Mytilene. He was too scared to participate from his home because the police had broken in the past and threatened Hassan with deportation. The group responded to Hassan's participation and tried to organize support for him, but it was not only that. Hassan really supported the group in times of COVID, in particular the 2 members of the group that got COVID. And he was very close to them through messages to support them in their recovery. Also, some people of the group tried to look employment possibilities for Hassan. Another image and a poem that I want to share is that of the moon. The image was written by Ahmad from Afghanistan, who shared with the group that the moon was his only companion when he was crossing borders. Ahmad was very young, 12 years old, when he left his family home. His mother had died and he chose to leave the home because he could not tolerate the way his father was treating his sisters. And he lived independently on his own by that time and working on his own. The little shiny ball that walked through me through many nights in my loneliness when I was happy or sad, listened to me when I was excited or exhausted. When I was passing the borders, or when I was sleeping on the rooftop of my house, the moon, the little shine ball, my safe home. When he shared this poem, different people from the group started sharing photos of the moon in their places, and here are some of them. The moon in Greece, in UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy. And this became like a code in the group where the people had created an asynchronous online conversation, and on that they would upload photos of the moon at different points. Ahmad decided to do, with the support of the group, a series of international art exhibitions, and some of these photos and some of his poetry were demonstrated also on that exhibition. And the group supported him, either volunteered or supported him in the organization of his exhibition. So as a group act, an act that emerged in the group intimate space, developed into an act in the public space with his initiative and the support of the group. Ahmad said in the evaluation interviews, I was living in Iran, in Turkey, in Greece, and I didn't feel belonging. I'm trying to convince myself that this is planet Earth, and I'm from here, and I belong here. That's how I felt in the group. We were in different places, in different countries, and we all belonged to each other. We built with each other. We were changing each other. Another participant from the group, who is from Greece, Despina, said, we just meet and we do not know a lot about each other, but we just know that we care about each other and we are here. It's interesting how I can feel this kind of emotions for some people that I have never seen and that I barely know where they are from. I will close with some of my critical reflections about this work that I shared. In this work, I and we tried to engage research as a struggle, to engage borders between refugees and locals, between the creative space and the public space. The research created opportunities for people to meet that they did not know each other. Some of the local Greek people in the group, they said that they have never met refugees before. They have heard things, they have read things, but it was the first time that they were meeting personally. And they also didn't know that the person that they were meeting was a refugee. Focus was on the relationships among refugees and locals, but what could have limited the scope of the research would be that the way that it was framed as creating belonging, it could, in a way, be more distant to those that have contested relationships. So what I did after the group ended was to add additional interviews to reach out to people that had contested relationships with refugees. The focus was on the agency of people, the right claims they made in response to the dehumanizing conditions and human rights violation. It shifted the discourse around integration of refugees as an exclusion paradigm to their acts. In the group space, people met and played with each other without knowing ahead their different backgrounds and positionings. The sharing of their struggles came after they had shared experiences together. And what came up in the interviews, as Despina said, that there was already created the ethics of care in the group. The focus was on the ethics of care and it was pivotal to build the group. And that could have also limited opportunities to engage conflict. It was only at the last sessions that the group started to challenge their assumptions for each other. And that could have also have to do with the fact that the group took place for 3 months. Creative methods created a stage for the group to share acts and to support new acts to emerge. The group's activity surpassed the group space to public space. That made it harder also to close and to define the outcomes of the research as they blended with the acts of the young people. And yet that made the research of value to the young people. The emerging creative methods are combined with critical analysis of the creative outcomes in an ethnographic context of the interlocutors' lives and the group's life. This is what I'm currently doing, writing the empirical analysis chapters. Our next step is to create an online community event where I have created a collective text comprised by anonymized experiences of people that participated in interviews in the group, and this will become the prompt for some of the young people who participated themselves in the group and in the project to create performances. A documentary, a theater performance, a song, and a photograph exhibition. This will happen on the 2nd of September, and you are very welcome if you want to join and to be part of it. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Elena. This is just like a wonderful piece of work. And it's yeah, what you've been talking is also quite touching, and it's difficult to, I'm sure, process for yeah, many of us. But this is wonderful. Thank you so much. And I already have so many questions for you. I'm sure our audiences also have their questions. And we'll proceed with Dan now. Who is actually give us a critical reflection of his experience of doing participatory visual methods and talk particularly in relation to voice. Hi, Dan.
Thank you. Sorry, I just loaded
Okay.
in.
Sorry, Elena, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, fine. I was just trying to take away my sharing, but having done is already a bit great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So, so I'm going to offer some critical reflections on participatory visual methods and voice, particularly that have come out of my own work in thinking through some of these things. So a bit of an introduction in terms of how I got to this point. My PhD research explored constructions of homelessness and made use of what I would have considered to be participatory visual methods at the time. But this left me with some unresolved questions about participatory visual methods and voice that I felt I'd not really considered critically enough during my own PhD research. So some of those questions that I had were around things like what counts as a participatory visual method and why do we use them? What is voice? What does it mean? How do we know about its presence or absence? And is there a link then between participatory visual methods and voice? And to what extent is it accurate to say there's a link, and to what extent is it that this might be overplayed or underplayed? So there are a whole host of participatory visual methods. I'm not claiming to talk about all of those here at this point, but I think generally speaking within the literature, there are some proclaimed advantages of using participatory visual methods. This isn't an exhaustive list, I should say, but just talk through some of these. I think the communicative power of the visual beyond the written word is spoken about on some occasions. The possibilities for collaboration and co-creation between those who might be normally thought of as research or facilitators and participants or co-creators. And within that, particularly the potential for challenging power imbalances between researchers and participants. The benefits of multiple knowledges being present within this relationship in a slightly different way to what is thought of in a traditional sense, perhaps. The possibilities and opportunities for self-reflection for those involved in these projects, and the potential for visual outputs and participatory outputs to generate dialogue and influence and change in ways that some research approaches might not have been so successful in achieving. But for me, I think there's still a need to remain critically aware in thinking through some of these things. Peter Beresford, in his book about participatory ideology, mentions that revolutionaries and reformers frequently seem to seek progressive change through methods that are exclusionary and narrowly based as those that they aim to displace. Now, he's not talking about research methods there, he's talking about methods of trying to make change. But I think that this is something worth bearing in mind when we talk about participatory visual methods as well. Quite often these are spoken about as perhaps in a progressive sense, in a way that does something different. Actually, the risks of overplaying that, I think, are true here. And Low et al. Talk about this in terms of the context of participatory video, and talk about the way that the majority of publications at the time that they were writing seem to describe the benefits of the methods, and in their view tended to be celebratory and uncritical, failing to address some of the difficulties that arise in theorizing and using these sorts of methods at different points of the research process. Now, I think that it's important to recognise that since Lowe and colleagues were writing, there's been an increase in the use of these methods. In fact, I think there's been a vast increase in the use of these methods over the past few years. And with that comes an increased scholarship around these methods. But it also raises some questions about how widely these sort of more slightly more critical approaches are adopted, and whether there's still this kind of over celebratory approach. So coming on to talk a little bit about voice and how this is spoken about within literature, Nick Caldry suggests that this can be understood as both a process of giving an account of one's life and the world in which we act, and as a value, giving weight to ways of structuring society that allows for this voice as a process, and particularly voice that matters. Luttrell and Chalfant talk about this capacity for reflection, for commentary, for reflexivity, and thinking about oneself in relation to one's social context. But in particular, if we think about voice that matters, this might be about expressing one's own voice in this way and about the right to be heard. In particular, Tiffany Ferry talks about this being linked to listening. So going beyond hearing voices, actually to listening, doing something more than just hearing these voices. Listening implies doing something with them rather than just hearing them. And in these ways, we can perhaps see that voice is linked to both agency and power. There's a potential for voice to be empowering in opposition to what might be thought of as a silencing. But as Barbara Cruikshank talks about, empowerment can also be related to responsibility. Actually, if we think about empowerment, it implies this notion of individual responsibility being built in. And I think that that's important to consider when we talk about this idea of voice as well. If we're saying that people have these voices, well, that also comes with it some responsibility potentially for those voices, and that has implications in terms of what we do. So I set out to explore this relationship a little bit more through a study that was funded by the ESRC's National Centre for Research Methods, and this aimed to critically explore this relationship in a little bit more detail. This study had 3 phases, if you like, to it. A first phase that aimed to explore researcher understandings of participatory visual methods and voice, and that was through workshops with researchers and practitioners. And then a second and third phase that were probably more tightly bound together in some ways. So this was through undertaking some participatory visual methods approaches, and then trying to evaluate from a participant perspective. So this was about creating life maps, videos, and autophotography. I should say that this changed actually initially from what I initially proposed with the funders, which was about participatory mapping. But actually, when I got to the place where this project was happening, people weren't really interested in that. They spoke about these different things instead. And that space, I should also mention, was the same space in which I undertook my PhD research. So this was a homelessness day centre, so a day centre for people that were experiencing homelessness and poverty. And at the time, the centre was under threat of being evicted from the space. So people were very interested in expressing why the centre mattered to them, what meaning it had for them, and what it would mean for them not to have that centre. So we created those visuals through that method, through those methods. Then, as part of this third phase, this aimed to evaluate those participatory visual methods as from an audience perspective. So there was a screening and exhibition to service providers within the day centre, where these 3 types of outputs were displayed, and then following that, and participants were invited to that. There were evaluative interviews with the people involved in the second phase as participants, and a focus group with the service providers present at the screening exhibition to try and understand these different perspectives. Today, I'm going to focus on participant perspectives, although I'm also quite happy to talk through research perspectives and audience perspectives during the Q&A if it would be helpful. So some reflections that came out of this, and these are reflections partly on what happened during the process and partly on what came out of the evaluative interviews as well. First of all, I think Elena already mentioned this, not everyone wants to be involved in these sorts of projects. They have their own particular biases in terms of thinking about what it means to be involved in a visual method or an arts-based method or things like this. So not everyone wants to be involved in these sorts of methods, and E.J. Milne talks about the importance of recognising non-participation when we're talking about participatory methods. I think also people get involved in different reasons in these projects for different reasons or with different goals or aims. I think it's important not to suggest some kind of homogenous reason for being involved or value for being involved. And this wasn't always about voice or ideas related to voice. People spoke about this being fun, being a challenge, about doing something with visual materials in particular. And I think also it's important to recognise that in this particular space where there were between 40 and 50 people accessing the service a day, and only probably 3 or 4 service providers in that space very often, actually one-on-one time was something that people wanted to have. So that was one of the reasons that some people got involved in this project. It wasn't particularly about creating something visual or a participatory project or anything like that. And also those goals and priorities and reasons for being involved aren't fixed. They change over time for the same people. So not only is there a diversity across who's involved, but also within each person, those things can change over time. People also had different understandings of what it meant for a participatory approach and a desire for different forms of participation at different parts of the process, but also within each element of the process. So some people spoke about this as teamwork, some people spoke about this as me facilitating technology for them. Some people spoke about my role as being an editor, and some people spoke about this as me being mentored by them on what life was like in this kind of scenario. That raises questions about what the researcher or facilitator role is in that kind of scenario, and how that shifts, and the kind of implications of that. So participation doesn't always mean the same thing, nor is the same thing necessarily desirable. So there was a real need for flexibility in the approach, and there wasn't a uniform way of thinking about participation that worked for everyone. People wanted very different things from this and wanted different ways of doing it. There are also conflicts and research responsibilities to think about there. If people are raising the idea that I'm an editor, then I have an editorial role, and that raises questions about my own biases to do with voice, or visuals, or what I do with those voices. Those are issues that I think are important to recognise. And there are conflicts for people in working through that, and conflicts between people in working through that. I think the importance of recognising that we enter pre-existing spaces, there are already relationships there before we go into those spaces, is important. And that raises questions in terms of our responsibilities, and whether we interrupt those relationships or those spaces, and what we do within that. I think people also spoke about perceptions of voice through participatory visual methods as being related to both the process of creating these materials, and the output, and this is spoken about in the literature. So for some, actually, external impact or recognition was the most important aspect of thinking about voice. Making a change mattered for some people, but for others, they really didn't want this. They wanted to be involved in the process, but this was either about self-reflection or about creating something, but it wasn't to be shared with other people. And actually, voice could carry with it some risks if it was seen externally. It wasn't risk-free, and that, I think, is really important to recognise, that voice isn't necessarily always a good for everyone that's involved in their own views. And people also had reflections on factors that they thought affected their sense of voice within the creation of these materials. Partly these were about visual norms. When we were creating videos, people in some cases didn't want them to be too long or too short. They had this idea of what the right length of the video was to keep people interested, but also to explain enough about aesthetic values. But also there were other factors that mattered for people: the setting in which we created these visual materials, the mood of people on the day, the relationship that they had with me, the perceptions about, particularly in the case of video, the appropriateness of their appearance on the video and how that would be perceived. There were really differing views on this, but these really mattered for people's sense of voice within these. And so I think this raises some implications for us for thinking about voice and participatory research. I think voice, what it means, how useful it is as a goal. Is it a universal good to aim for all of the time? And what does voice mean in different contexts for different people? I think it became clear that the path to voice wasn't always straightforward, and it wasn't always immediately clear or clearly beneficial for the people involved. People had very different views of what voice was, and whether it was good or not, and whether it would serve the goals that they had. And it raises questions, I think, for how we balance the positives and the risks to do with voice, particularly for those involved. So there are questions then that come out of that about how we ensure that participation is serving the best interests of those involved. I remember in one case in particular, one person was very critical of the service, and I mean, we both knew that it was going to be shown to service providers, but that raised some questions about actually how that would be perceived by those service providers, and whether any consequences would come of that. So there are questions for me about how we manage when aspects of voice might seem to be working against a person's best interests, and that sometimes can sit uncomfortably in terms of thinking about editing and attempts to democratize knowledge production and the authenticity, if you like. I mean, I think there are other questions about that, but the authenticity of those voices and what we do in our editorial role, if we have one in those projects, and what we do about the kind of multiple desires and motivations that people have for participation, where these might be contradictory within a project and where these might change over time, and how we recognise the lasting existence of these materials beyond the lifetime of those projects and what implications that has for people who are involved in these kinds of projects. Also, I think it's important to recognise that participation and voice can shape and be shaped by each other, and that researchers have a role in shaping those voices and what participation looks like, and that it's important to reflect on our own role and biases within that and the implications of these. Also, I think it's important to recognise the possibilities and limits to the researcher role, especially in thinking about voice. I could try and do what I could with these materials, but I couldn't promise that this service wouldn't be evicted. That's what some people wanted from this. They wanted to save the service. That's not something that I could promise through this. So, as Claudia Mitchell and colleagues highlight, I think reflexivity is key in this. And it also raises questions about ethics, voice, and participatory visual methods. I think ethical conundrums quite often arise in using these materials, and sometimes they aren't fully resolved or resolvable. There are questions and ongoing questions for me about the relationship between power and voice and the trade-offs and tensions that come with working with participatory visual methods. Sometimes I think there aren't any simple answers, but I think that that's important to recognise and to reflect on. And I'm always at pains to say that although these are critical reflections, this definitely doesn't mean that I think these methods have no value. I think they're really valuable in lots of ways, and I've made use of them before and since. But that we need to remain critically aware and reflective when we're using them, particularly in terms of our own practices and the implications of these. Sorry. So thank you for listening. That's my presentation over, and if you'd like to hear more, then feel free to get in touch.